Last time we spoke about the Formosa Air Battle. In mid-1944, General MacArthur and Admirals Nimitz and Halsey debated their next move in the Pacific. MacArthur, intent on a direct assault upon the Philippines, clashed with Nimitz, who favored invading Formosa. MacArthur's persuasive tactics, political savvy, and to be more blunt, threats during a rather dramatic visit to Honolulu convinced President FDR to prioritize the Philippines. Despite MacArthur's grandstanding, FDR did not completely abandon the U.S. Navy's plans, and MacArthur's plan would require significant naval support, with carrier strikes planned to soften up the Japanese defenses. In October, Halsey's carriers launched devastating strikes against Formosa, leading to heavy Japanese losses and disrupting their air power. Despite some fierce counterattacks and damage to American warships, including the cruiser Canberra, the American forces achieved air supremacy. The successful air campaign set the stage for the invasion of Leyte, marking a pivotal shift in the Pacific War. This episode is The Return to the Philippines. Welcome back to the Pacific War podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, found at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. For podcasts, I'm on episode 7 of my North Africa campaign during World War II series. And over on YouTube, I just released The Japanese Invasion of North China, The Battle of Rehe. That episode contains new animation from the new animator I purchased using funding from my Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what it will tackle next. And all the money is going to paying a very good animator who I hope to keep on for a lot of projects. So please, if you have a chance, go check it out. We last left off a week before the grand return to the Philippines. Admiral Halsey had dispatched his carrier forces to neutralize enemy bases in Formosa in preparation for General MacArthur's Leyte invasion. However, Admiral Toyoda's response was unexpectedly strong, resulting in 2 cruisers being torpedoed, which forced Admiral Mitcher to order a retreat eastwards under pressure from Japanese aviators. On October the 15th, while the cruisers Houston and Canberra were being towed under the protection of Admiral McCain's carriers, Halsey directed Admirals Bogan and Sherman, with their task groups, to withdraw eastwards out of sight. At the same time, Admiral Davison's forces carried out intermittent air raids on northern Luzon to keep enemy aircraft at bay. More significantly, Halsey decided to turn the situation into an opportunity. He instructed McCain's units to send out open messages pleading for assistance. This tactic, which Halsey called the lure of the streamlined bait, was designed to mislead the Japanese into believing that his task group was all that remained of the fleet, enticing them to move in for the kill. Halsey's other task groups, which had withdrawn eastwards, would then return to engage and destroy the enemy. On October the 14th, Japanese aviators claimed 2 carriers, 1 battleship, and 1 heavy cruiser sunk, and 1 small carrier, 1 battleship, and 1 light cruiser set afire. These incredibly exaggerated claims of the Japanese Air Forces were accepted jubilantly on the home islands. The people felt that the American Navy had indeed been given a death blow, and the Finance Ministry distributed celebration sake to all the households in the country to commemorate the event. Tokyo Radio made the unfounded claim that, quote, a total of 57 enemy warships, including 19 aircraft carriers and 4 battleships, were sunk or heavily damaged by Japanese forces. The enemy task forces lost the majority of their strength and were put to a rout. It was also predicted that the Allied losses would delay the invasion of the Philippine Islands by 2 months. Admiral Halsey's reaction was to report that, quote, all Third Fleet ships reported by Radio Tokyo as sunk, have now been salvaged and are retiring towards the enemy. The exaggerated claims of success made by Japanese pilots further convinced Toyota to continue the assault, despite heavy aircraft losses. Meanwhile, Admiral Shima's strike force was already rushing south from inland sea to support the air forces. However, Shima's force was not the only one speeding towards the battlefront. On October the 13th, Admiral Barby's convoy, consisting of over 470 ships, carrying the 24th Division and 6th Army Service Command, finally departed Hollandia, heading towards the designated far shore of Leyte. The next day, the convoy crossed the equator without any ceremony. By October the 15th, Task Force 78, which included the 1st Cavalry Division, joined the massive convoy. With General Sibbert's full 10th Corps now en route to Leyte, the plan was to rendezvous with Admiral Wilkinson's Task Force 79. Over the course of about 2 weeks, General Hodge's 24th Corps had been transported from Hawaii to Eniwetok and then to Manus Island. On October the 11th, the LSTs carrying the assault battalions departed Manus, followed by Wilkinson's convoy of 267 ships, which left the Admiralties just 3 days later. Their progress was steady. By October the 17th, Wilkinson's tractor groups began joining the 7th Fleet. This combined fleet formed the largest convoy ever seen in the Pacific up to that point. Meanwhile, during the Formosa Air Battle, Japanese aviators launched multiple strikes against Task Groups 38.1 and 38.4 from dawn to dusk on October the 15th. Fortunately, the American carriers' reinforced combat air patrols effectively minimized the damage, with only one glancing bomb hitting the Franklin. In retaliation, Admiral Mitcher's pilots claimed to have shot down more than 100 Japanese aircraft. Additionally, Admiral Davison's carriers attacked enemy air concentrations in Luzon, though they faced heavy resistance from Vice Admiral Terioka Kempei's reorganized 1st Air Fleet. These engagements continued over the next 2 days, with American forces estimated to having destroyed 99 enemy aircraft on the ground and 95 in the air by October the 19th. On the morning of the 16th, Mitcher's carriers conducted long-range searches to determine if the enemy had fallen for Halsey's trap. Meanwhile, Japanese morning reconnaissance flights over the western Philippine Sea spotted 3 enemy task groups with a combined total of 13 carriers in the vicinity, forcing Toyota to reluctantly cancel Shima's planned attack. As a result, no surface engagement materialized from Halsey's lure of the streamlined bait tactic. However, 247 naval aircraft were promptly dispatched from Okinawa, Formosa, and Luzon to locate the enemy groups. McCain continued to fend off persistent Japanese air assaults, which managed to land another torpedo hit on the Houston. Hellcats from light carriers Cabot and Cowpens did great execution against a Japanese formation of over 100 aircraft. However, 3 Jills penetrated the screen. One twin-engine plane fought through the cap, and the ship's anti-aircraft batteries surviving just long enough to put a torpedo in the water before the plane itself crashed into the sea. That torpedo struck the after portion of the starboard side of Houston, blowing 20 men overboard and spreading gasoline fires in the waters all around the cruiser. The explosion set fire to the starboard tank that held fuel for the ship's reconnaissance floatplanes, causing a major fire in the aircraft hangar, though the remaining crew suppressed the blaze within just 15 minutes. Flooding from this hit degraded the ship's buoyancy and stability further. Another 300 men were evacuated afterwards, leaving just 200 aboard to continue damage control efforts as the other ships withdrew. Despite the cruisers suffering significant damage, the towing operation carried on, slowly guiding the task group towards Naval Base Ulithi, which they eventually reached on October the 27th. On October the 17th, the Japanese were still in pursuit of the retreating fleet, but contact was lost and further attacks were aborted. Nevertheless, the Formosa Air Battle had one final chapter. After the successful strike on Okayama on October the 14th, General LeMay deemed the damage extensive enough that it wasn't necessary to send all available B-29s for mop-up operations. On October the 16th, only the 444th and 462nd Bombardment Groups were dispatched to hit Okayama, while the 468th targeted Heito, an airbase and staging field east of Takao. Of 49 planes airborne against Okayama, only 28 bombed there, but they were aided by 5 stragglers from the 468th Group. To even things up, a formation of 11 planes from the 444th flew calmly by its Okayama target and struck at Heito through an error by the lead bombardier. Other B-29s bombed alternate or chance targets at Takeo, Toshien, Swatao, and Xintian harbors, at Hanyang, and several airdromes including Taichu and Formosa. This dual mission was less smooth than that of October 14th's raid, but no losses were reported. The next day, 23 B-29s from the 40th Bombardment Group attacked the Anansho Air Depot near Tianjin to complete the Formosa campaign. Heavy clouds prevented 13 of the bombers from reaching the target, so they diverted to bomb Takeo Harbor instead. Despite these challenges, LeMay's bombers inflicted significant damage overall. By the end of the Formosa Air Battle, the Japanese had launched a total of 761 offensive sorties. Toyota's pilots reported that nearly the entire Third Fleet had been sunk, and that the American carrier force was in ruins. For comedic effect, why not go through the real list of what these Japanese pilots were claiming? So, they had sunk 11 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 1 destroyer, or possibly a light cruiser. They damaged 8 carriers, 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 1 destroyer, 13 unidentified ships. And in addition, at least 12 other ships were set afire. So yeah, these exaggerated claims were heavily promoted by newspapers, although figures like Toyota within the Imperial Japanese Navy remained skeptical, and rightfully so. In reality, the Japanese Air Forces were decisively beaten at Formosa, losing around 171 planes in the initial defense and another 321 during the attacks on Mitcher's fleet, a total of about nearly 500 aircraft. The Second Air Fleet, comprising the main strength of the Navy's base air forces, had lost 50% of their strength, and they were reduced to 230 operational aircraft. The First Air Fleet and the Fourth Air Army in the Philippines were left with a combined operational strength of just about over 100 aircraft. Of 143 carrier planes used to reinforce the Second Air Fleet, about one-third with their flight crews had been lost. Allied estimates, however, placed Japanese losses as high as nearly 700. In addition to these aircraft losses, Japan suffered significant casualties amongst their air personnel, which severely weakened Admiral Ozawa's 3rd and 4th Carrier Divisions and left General Yamashita with limited air support for the defense of the Philippines. On the other hand, Halsey's force had lost only 89 aircraft, with 2 cruisers suffering serious damage. The radar-guided Hellcats easily repelled the fragmented Japanese attacks, causing no delays to the American operations and inflicting no serious damage on Task Force 38. This defeat significantly diminished Japan's ability to defend the Philippines, as their surface forces were now left without effective air cover. In the aftermath of the battle, the aggressive Vice Admiral Onishi Takeshiro assumed command of the First Air Fleet and initiated the creation of a suicide corps, recruiting volunteers to dive-bomb enemy vessels. Thus was born the Kamikaze Special Attack Corps. Captain Motoharu Akimura, in charge of Tateyama Base and the 341st Air Group Home, is theorized to be the first officer to propose the use of kamikaze attack tactics. Commander Asayachi Tamai asked a group of 23 student pilots whom he had trained to volunteer for the first Special Kamikaze Attack Force. All of them did so willingly. The names of the 4 subunits within the Kamikaze Special Attack Force were Unit Shikishima, Unit Yamato, Unit Asahi, and Unit Yamasakura. LeMay reported the destruction of 65 buildings and damage to 9 out of 80 at Okayama's assembly plant, along with the destruction of 7 hangars and 16 buildings and damage to 9 others at the airbase. As a result, LeMay's intelligence team estimated it would take between 4 and 6 months to fully restore the Okayama plant to be fully operational again. His final strike of the month occurred on October the 25th, targeting the Omura aircraft factory, with 78 B-29 bombers successfully taking off. Over Omura, 59 planes dropped 156 tons of bombs, while 11 hit various other targets. Despite moderate resistance, 1 bomber was lost during the attack. Strike photos and subsequent reconnaissance showed significant damage, especially in the aluminum fabrication area. Over the following 3 months, Omura would become a primary target for Operation Matterhorn, though the 20th Bomber Command also conducted additional strikes to support Allied operations in Southeast Asia, China, and the Philippines. Meanwhile, minesweepers and other vessels had cleared the way for an amphibious flotilla to come in. In early dawn of October the 17th, the minesweepers began their work on the channel approaches to Sulan Island. By 6:30 a.m., they had accomplished their task and they began to sweep the waters of the landing areas in Leyte Gulf until the storm forced them to suspend operations. At 1 p.m., they resumed sweeping with great difficulty. Until A-Day, intensive area and tactical minesweeping continued. The sweepers started at dawn each day. They worked continuously until nightfall. By October the 19th, it was known that the Japanese had heavily mined the approaches to Leyte Gulf, but that there were no mines within the Gulf itself. However, the northern part of the main channel into the Gulf was not considered to be safe. By the same date, sweeping had been completed in the southern half. About 186 mines had been destroyed. At about 1:35 a.m. on October the 19th, the destroyer supporting the minesweeping units which were in the Gulf struck a floating mine, and while maneuvering away from the area struck another. The ship was disabled and retired from action. By A-Day, a total of 227 mines had been destroyed, and a passage approximately 6 miles wide had been cleared just north of Dinagat Island. All ships were therefore directed to enter Leyte Gulf through that portion of the strait. As the minesweepers came close to the land, boats containing Filipinos moved out to welcome the advance party of liberators. The reception they met was not enthusiastic. Admiral Oldendorf reported this: "Suspected that some might have come seeking information, so detained them aboard their respective ships. Directed no further patriots be taken aboard ship." With Halsey's forces still in the Formosa region, these ships were under the air cover of General Whitehead's 5th Air Force and Admiral Kincaid's escort carriers. While minesweepers and demolition teams worked to clear mines, remove transport barriers, and perform beach reconnaissance, Company D of the 6th Ranger Battalion prepared to land on Juliant Island on October the 17th. Supported by fire from the USS Denver, and in heavy rain, the Rangers successfully landed on the beach at about 8 a.m. without any opposition. The men immediately filed south 500 yards on a trail along the coast and then headed east towards the lighthouse. On the way, 4 buildings, one of which contained a Japanese radio, were found set ablaze. The company then continued along the trail. Suddenly, the enemy fired from a concealed position, killing 1 man and wounding another. When Company D went into attack formation, the enemy force disappeared into the heavy jungle bordering the trail. The march was resumed and the company reached its objective without further incident. The lighthouse, which had been damaged by naval bombardment, and adjoining buildings were destroyed. Unfortunately, a Japanese radio station successfully reported the enemy's convoy's approach, and the start of the Rangers' landings revealed that Leyte was the Americans' ultimate target. In response, Toyota swiftly initiated Operation Shogo, ordering Vice Admiral Kurita Takeo's 1st Striking Force to move from Linga Anchorage to Brunei Bay, preparing to strike the enemy's invasion fleet. Just after midnight on October the 18th, Kurita's ships departed Linga Anchorage and began their trek to Leyte. Sentai Division 16 heavy cruiser Aoba, light cruiser Kino, and destroyer Urinami were ordered to detach from Kurita's command to head to Manila. These ships were all amongst the oldest in Kurita's fleet, but it was a mistake to detach them from a secondary transport mission when they would have been better used to augment the decisive attack planned for Kurita's force. Simultaneously, Shima's 2nd Striking Force, reinforced by Kurita's detached 16th Cruiser Division, was tasked with supporting counter-landings. The 2nd Striking Force for this newly assigned mission was to be composed only of the 5th Fleet, that being 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 7 destroyers, plus the 16th Cruiser Division, which consisted of 1 heavy cruiser, 1 light cruiser, 1 destroyer, detached from the 1st Striking Force. Under this plan, the 16th Cruiser Division was ordered to proceed to Manila, while the 2nd Striking Force, main body, then at Amami Oshima in the Ryukyus, was ordered to go first to Mako, refuel, and then proceed to the Philippines. By noon, another order was issued to Ozawa's main body, despite its depleted air power, to coordinate a sortie from home waters in support of the attack planned for the morning of October the 25th in Leyte Gulf. The mission of the Ozawa force was of vital importance to the success of the overall plan. It was to act as a decoy to draw off the main strength of the enemy naval forces covering the invasion operations in Leyte Gulf, thus allowing the 1st Striking Force to penetrate the landing point and smash the enemy's troop and supply ships. To heighten its effectiveness as a lure, the Ozawa force sortied with all of the 3rd Carrier Division, made up of the regular carrier Zoikaku and the light carriers Zoyo, Chitose, and Chiyoda. The total number of aircraft available to put on board these ships, however, was only 108. These belonged to the poorly trained air groups of the 1st Carrier Division and represented about half the normal complement. In addition to the half-empty carriers, the force comprised 2 battleships, 3 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers. Ozawa fully anticipated that his fleet would be completely wiped out, but this sacrifice was deemed essential to achieve the primary objective, the destruction of the entire enemy invasion force. As a result of the transfer of the flying groups of the 3rd and 4th Carrier Divisions to the 2nd Air Fleet for the Formosa Air Battle, the task force main body had lost much of its planned striking power. The mission assigned to it was therefore less offensive, than that assigned to the original Shogo battle plan. The original plan had called for a diversionary attack by the Ozawa force against the enemy's main carrier task forces. Under the more general terms of the October 18th plan, however, Vice Admiral Ozawa was left with discretion to choose an attack target more commensurate with the strength of his force. Meanwhile, Davison's carrier aircraft launched attacks on air bases around Manila and Legazpi, but neither the 1st Air Fleet nor the 4th Air Army could respond due to adverse weather. As these strikes were carried out in difficult conditions, General Terauchi concluded by nightfall that a significant enemy operation was underway. He then activated the Army component of Shogo, instructing Lieutenant General Tominaga Kyoji to target enemy ships near Leyte. Should the enemy successfully land, General Suzuki's 35th Army was ordered to delay their advance until reinforcements arrived, with the goal of launching a counterattack to defeat the Americans by October the 25th. Given the recent actions at Sulian and the American naval presence in Leyte Gulf, the Army and Naval General Headquarters sections surprisingly coordinated their response, with the IJA staff approving the Southern Army's request to implement Shogo. It was determined that the coming decisive battle for Japan was going to be at the Philippines. One major difference was the battle's location. Terauchi, Yamashita, and other Southern Army officers believed it would be Luzon and not Leyte. With Shogo 1 focused on Leyte, the Japanese would have to fight in the central Philippines without extensive defensive works or major airfields. Yamashita would also use his limited shipping to send reinforcements to Leyte. If the Japanese lost Leyte, there might not be sufficient strength to defeat decisively any American offensive on Luzon. Deploying the few IJ units to Leyte would make a Luzon defense harder to accomplish. Shogo 1 could hand the control of the Philippines effectively to the Americans. Eventually, Terauchi agreed with the Imperial General Headquarters' position of making Leyte the primary location to fight the Americans. Believing that Halsey's fleet had been defeated off Formosa, Terauchi now thought the Americans could not sustain any major operations or contest reinforcement convoys. Both poor assumptions that would later cause suffering for the IJA. Yamashita disagreed with Terauchi and the Imperial General Headquarters about designating Leyte as the prime battle site. But on October the 22nd, Terauchi finally ordered Yamashita and the 4th Air Army to make Leyte the main point of attack. His opinion was, quote, "The opportunity to annihilate the enemy is at hand." However, Yamashita was convinced that the Americans had greater strength than anticipated, given the continued carrier attacks. Meanwhile, at 12:30 on October the 17th, the Rangers had successfully landed at Dinagat Island, finding no Japanese forces there. On the morning of the 18th, the ship's address system clanged out general quarters. The men went below, put on their gear, and checked their weapons. At 9 a.m., the troops were told to prepare to disembark. They bolted up the ladders and spilled out over deck to the davits. The boats were lowered and the first wave started for the beach. At the same time, the guns from the destroyer and frigate, which had escorted the transports, concentrated fire against the shoreline for 12 minutes. 3 minutes later, the boats grounded on coral reef 40 yards from the beach, and the men waded the remaining distance to the shore. They encountered no resistance, and at 10:38, the company commander, Captain Arthur D. Simmons, notified the battalion commander, "Beachhead secured, supplies ashore, no resistance, no casualties." The company set up a channel light. They quickly set up a navigation light at Desolation Point to guide the main convoy. However, bad weather and tides delayed the landing at Homonhon Island. Colonel Mucci's Company B finally made it ashore the next morning without opposition and installed another navigation light. At the same time, Tominaga attempted to retaliate but was thwarted by a violent storm. In the afternoon, Kincaid's forces, supported by Mitscher's carriers, conducted minesweeping and direct fire missions on Leyte beaches to protect the underwater demolition teams. Admiral Oldendorf's warships heavily bombarded the southern beaches, paving the way for the transports to enter Leyte Gulf by the following evening. These pre-landing operations, which continued throughout October the 19th on the northern landing beaches, alerted General Makino to a potential secondary landing closer to Tacloban. This maneuver would outflank the main strength of the 16th Division and directly threaten his headquarters. In response, Makino relocated his headquarters from Tacloban to Dagami and ordered the 33rd Regiment to reinforce the Palo San Jose coastal sector, while the 2nd Battalion strengthened the southern defenses. Despite these last-minute efforts, Makino's forces were unprepared for the overwhelming assault. The heavy naval gunfire had destroyed many defensive positions and disabled most of the 22nd Field Artillery's regimental guns. Furthermore, although the weather now favored Tominaga's counterstrikes, American carrier operations had been so effective that he was unable to challenge their air supremacy. Despite the optimism of the High Command with regard to the prospects of gaining eventual air superiority in the battle area, it was already evident that, in the air phase of Shogo, it was not working out as intended. Those plans had envisioned mass air attacks against the invading enemy naval forces and troop convoys beginning prior to their arrival at the landing point. The enemy, however, had forestalled these plans by striking at Leyte before the planned concentration of Japanese air strength in the Philippines had been completed, and before the Navy's base air forces had time to recover from the losses sustained in the Formosa Air Battle and earlier enemy carrier strikes on the Philippines. The first air fleet already in the Philippines had been reduced to an operational strength of less than 50 aircraft. The second air fleet, which had lost half of its strength in the Formosa battle, had not yet begun its redeployment from Formosa to the Philippines. Although the 4th Air Army had sustained relatively lighter losses, its strength was widely dispersed. Before it could operate effectively in the Leyte area, it had to concentrate at forward bases in the central Philippines, an operation rendered both difficult and dangerous by enemy action, bad weather, and the virtually useless condition of many of the forward fields due to continuous rains. Under such unfavorable conditions, the concentration required a minimum of several days, and in the meanwhile the enemy was able to operate in Leyte Gulf against extremely light air opposition. On October the 19th, when weather conditions finally permitted an air attack against the enemy invasion fleet, no more than 5 naval and 3 Army aircraft could be mustered against the steadily increasing concentration of enemy shipping in Leyte Gulf. By the evening of October the 19th, the preliminary operations were nearly complete, with most of Kinkaid's fleet positioned outside the Gulf. Since the minefield at the entrance hadn't been fully cleared, the ships entered slightly south of the entrance's center, avoiding the main channel and staying close to Dinagat's northern point. Meanwhile, Suzuki had already activated the Suzu Plan, with units from the 30th and 102nd Divisions preparing to move towards Ormoc. However, before they could depart, Oldendorf began October the 20th with 2 simultaneous pre-landing bombardments, each involving 3 battleships. After 2 hours of battleship fire, cruisers and destroyers followed with high explosive shells, causing significant damage. At the same time, Kinkaid's escort carriers launched bombing and strafing runs against suspected defensive positions and airfields, severely disrupting Makino's radio and telegraph communications. At 8 a.m., the first anchor chain of the vessels had rattled out. LCVPs were quickly swung over the sides, boats circled motherships and moved to their rendezvous areas. The LCI motor and LCI rocket ships took their places at the head of the assault waves. It was now 9:45 a.m., 15 minutes before H hour. The LCIs raced simultaneously to the shores of Leyte, raking the landing beaches with rocket and motor fire. The bombardment grew heavier and more monotonous. Hundreds of small boats, flanked by rocket ships and destroyers, headed towards the beaches. Thousands of rockets hit the beaches with the rumble of an earthquake. It was impossible to distinguish one explosion from another in the unbroken roar. By 9:30 a.m., the 21st Regiment successfully landed on Panon Island without resistance, securing control of the entrance to Saugat Bay. 15 minutes later, the transport sped towards Leyte shores, led by the LCI gunboats, which pounded the beaches with rockets and mortar fire. At 10 a.m., Sibert's 10th Corps, covered by a heavy rocket barrage, landed on white and red beaches, marking the Americans' return to the Philippines. Admiral Fitzgerald's transports delivered General Mudge's 1st Cavalry Division to White Beach, where the brigades landed side by side, with the 8th Cavalry Regiment held in floating reserve. Facing only small arms and machine gun fire, the 1st Squadron of the 7th Cavalry Regiment swiftly secured the Catasan Peninsula and its airfield, while the 2nd Squadron captured San Jose and advanced across the Burayan River, reaching a point 3,000 yards from the beach. The 5th and 12th Cavalry Regiments had to navigate a deep swamp to access Highway 1, then push westwards until they encountered enemy resistance near the foothills of Caiban. At 10:40 a.m., Mudge's reserves began to land, followed by the divisional artillery at 1:30 p.m. Meanwhile, to the south, Barbie's transports landed General Irving's 24th Division on the shallow Red Beach, with the 19th and 34th Regiments landing abreast in battalion columns. The Japanese permitted the first 5 waves to land, but when the remaining waves were about 2,000 yards offshore, they unleashed heavy artillery and motor fire, sinking several landing craft and causing significant casualties. The first elements of the 3rd Battalion, 34th Infantry inadvertently landed 300 yards north of the assigned area and were immediately pinned down by heavy machine gun and rifle fire. The commanding officer of the regiment, Colonel Aubrey Newman, arrived on the beach and, noting the situation, shouted to his men, "Get the hell off the beach. Get up and get moving. Follow me." Thus urgently prompted, the men followed him into the wooded area. To the south, the 19th Infantry, with the 3rd Battalion in its lead, also struck heavy opposition in the sector of its beach. Through error, the first waves of the regiment landed almost directly behind the 34th Infantry and 800 yards north of the proposed landing point. The later waves landed at the planned spot. Company K did not land on schedule because its command boat broke down. Going in under heavy fire, the company had all of its officers except one killed or wounded. One of its platoons were unable to make contact with the rest of the company until the following day. Upon landing, the first waves were immediately pinned down by intense machine gun and rifle fire. Despite this, the Americans successfully stormed the initial defenses of the 33rd Regiment. By 12:15, the 34th Regiment had cleared the beach of enemy forces, and after a preparatory concentration, its 3rd Battalion advanced approximately 400 yards. The 2nd Battalion then moved through the 3rd, crossing Highway 1 at 3:50, and established positions for the night 100 yards west of the highway. To the south, the 3rd Battalion, 19th Regiment, had reached Highway 1, while the battered 1st Battalion followed behind under heavy fire. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion landed and advanced cautiously as the 1st Battalion pressed towards Hill 522, amidst fierce resistance. Hill 522, which rose directly from the river's edge north of Palau, overlooked the landing beaches, and its upward trails were steep and winding. Hill 522 presented the most significant terrain feature which would have to be overcome before the American forces could push into the interior of Palau, and it constituted one of the chief objectives for A-Day. 3 months earlier, General Makino had started to fortify it, impressing nearly all of the male population of Palau for the work. By A-Day, they had constructed 5 well-camouflaged pillboxes of rocks, planking, and logs covered with earth. Numerous tunnels honeycombed the hill. The communication trenches were 7 feet deep. They eventually encircled enemy positions and began to make steady progress up the hill. By dusk, Companies B and C had captured the hill's crests and successfully repelled several enemy counterattacks. This achievement secured Hill 522, which commanded the route into the interior and overlooked Palau, the gateway to Leyte Valley. At 2:30, General Douglas MacArthur landed on Red Beach alongside President Sergio Osmeña, who had just taken over from Manuel Quezon following his death on August the 1st. So if you actually go on YouTube right now, you can see footage of MacArthur and everybody wading ashore. To this day, there is a monument of this iconic moment. MacArthur then rushed over to make a radio broadcast to the Filipino people, declaring, "People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated in the blood of our two peoples. We have come dedicated and committed to the task of destroying every vestige of enemy control over your daily lives, and of restoring upon a foundation of indestructible strength the liberties of your people." And with that, General Douglas MacArthur had finally fulfilled his promise to the Filipino people. Further south, Hodge's 24th Corps encountered more resistance as it landed at Orange, Blue, Violet, and Yellow beaches at 10 a.m. Under the transport of Rear Admiral Forrest Royal ships and the protection of LCI gunboats, General Bradley's 96th Division landed with its regiments positioned between the Calbasag River and the town of San Jose. The 382nd Regiment successfully disembarked on Blue beaches at 9:50 a.m., followed by the 383rd Regiment on the Orange beaches 10 minutes later. As they advanced inland, both units faced intermittent mortar and artillery fire from the 9th Regiment positioned on Catmount Hill. Colonel Macy Dill's 3rd Battalion initially encountered obstacles such as tank barriers made of coconut logs, debris on the beaches, and heavy bombardment from Hill 120. However, with motor and naval gunfire support, the battalion eventually captured the hill and repelled several enemy counterattacks, though they were unable to continue to advance due to deep swamps. In contrast, Dill's 2nd Battalion managed to push about 2,500 yards inland, despite the intense heat and swampy conditions. Over to the north, Colonel Edwin May's 1st and 2nd Battalions were similarly hindered by an unexpected swamp, but still succeeded in securing San Jose and the head of the Labrianan River, advancing approximately 2,600 yards inland. By 6 p.m., Bradley's artillery had been landed, although the 381st Regiment remained in floating reserve. Further south, Admiral Connolly's transports landed General Arnold's 7th Division between the Calbasag and Dugutan rivers, with regiments landing side by side. Companies L and K of the 3rd Battalion, 32nd Regiment landed abreast. Company L on the left ran into heavy fire from Japanese machine gunners who had waited until the leading elements of the company exposed themselves. The Japanese were entrenched in bunkers and placed in hedgerows and banana groves. The pillboxes, which were mutually supporting, were located at the ends of the hedgerows and occasionally in the middle of an open field. Each pillbox had machine guns and anti-tank guns. Company L suffered a number of casualties and were pinned down quickly. The enemy gunners then turned to Company K and stopped its forward movement. In the space of 15 minutes, 2 officers and 6 men of the 3rd Battalion were killed, and 1 officer and 18 men were wounded. Of the medium tanks that had come ashore at 10:30 a.m., 3 were sent to support Company L and 2 to support Company K. The later 2 were knocked out before they could adjust their fire on the pillboxes. The leading tank sent in to support Company L was knocked out by a direct hit from an anti-tank gun. With 2 tanks remaining, it was decided to hit the flanks of the entrenched pillboxes at 1:45. A platoon of Company K went to the right and another platoon from the company to the left. Simultaneously, the remaining elements of the 2 companies coordinated with the tanks assaulted the pillboxes. The heavy volume of fire kept the enemy guns quiet until they could be finished off with grenades. The pillboxes were knocked out without further casualties. Paralleling the route of advance of Company L were several hedge fences behind which were enemy machine guns and mortars. Although under heavy fire, the company was able to break through the first barriers with the aid of tanks. At 4:30, since the enemy fire continued its volume, the 32nd Regiment withdrew and established a defensive position for the night. Meanwhile, the 184th Regiment landed its 3rd Battalion at Yellow Beach 2, directly in front of Dulag, and its 1st Battalion at Yellow Beach 1, which was farther south and separated by a swamp. Both beaches saw surprisingly little resistance, allowing the 184th to advance more quickly than expected, successfully capturing Dulag and reaching its airfield. Behind them, the reserve 2nd Battalion and the 3rd Battalion of the 17th Regiment landed after midday. The 3rd Battalion pushed west and south with minimal opposition, successfully securing the bridge over the Dugutan River at Dao. By the end of the day, both corps had fallen short of their beachhead objectives, with Hodge's 24th Corps achieving particularly modest results. Despite this, the 6th Army had successfully landed assault forces along the entire eastern coast of Leyte and gained control of the Panawan Strait, with casualties totaling 49 killed, 192 wounded, and 6 missing. Most of the 16th Division had retreated during the naval and air bombardment before the landing, which allowed the Americans to secure most of the coastal defenses before the enemy could regroup. Consequently, the only Japanese forces encountered were those left behind to delay the invasion. A more substantial enemy engagement was yet to come. Air opposition to the invasion was minimal, as Tominaga and the Naval Air Forces continued to concentrate their strength in the Philippines in preparation for a major air offensive scheduled to begin on October the 25th. However, 37 Army and Navy planes attacked the invasion shipping off Leyte. At about 4 p.m. on October the 20th, an enemy torpedo plane was sighted and it aimed its torpedoes at Honolulu. Despite the skillful maneuvering of Captain Thurber to evade, the torpedo found its mark on her port side. 64 men were killed, 35 were injured. Flooding caused a temporary severe list, but the ship was saved by efficient damage measures. Yet with that, Honolulu was out of the fight. Honolulu sailed out the next day, arriving at Manus on October the 29th for temporary repairs, and then steamed for Norfolk, Virginia, on November the 19th, arriving on December the 20th via Pearl Harbor, San Diego, California, and Panama Canal. Unfortunately, not all went well with the logistics. Although about 110,000 tons of supplies had been landed on Leyte by the end of A-Day, it was a haphazard operation. The Navy was responsible for transporting the troops and the supplies to the target area. Ships companies unloaded the cargo from the cargo vessels and transported it in small craft to the beaches. Many of the ships had been improperly loaded for the journey to Leyte. The cargo should have been so loaded that articles first needed would be the last put on board. Instead, it had been stowed haphazardly, with little attention given to the problem of unloading. As a result of the faulty stowage of supplies on the ships, many badly needed items were at the bottom of the holds, and articles that would be needed until much later in the operation were piled on top of them. The supplies were set ashore in random fashion and then were carelessly thrown onto trucks and other vehicles. This sort of handling resulted in the loss of carrying capacity, in slow removal of the loads, and in consequent delay in return of the vehicles to the landing beaches. Thus, officers complained about the disorganized effort to deliver, store, and distribute supplies. This was a precursor of future resupply problems. As the landings proceeded about as smoothly as could be hoped, Admiral Halsey ordered Task Groups 38.1 and 38.4 to head to Ulithi on October the 22nd, as he doubted that the Japanese would mount a major operation in response to the American invasion. And yet, the Japanese are about to come calling for another decisive battle. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. For podcasts, me and my co-host just did an entire episode on the best and worst generals of every faction in World War II. It is pretty entertaining. As for YouTube, I am about to release the first episode with my new animator, and it is the first episode in a series on Japan's invasion of northern China, this one being Operation Nika, the invasion of Rehe. The way I was able to pay for a new animator was because of my Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. For as low as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. General Douglas MacArthur had finally done it. He had returned to the Philippines, making good on his promise to the Filipino people. It was a colossal effort, and thus far it was going very well, all things considered. However, little did the Americans know, but the Imperial Japanese Navy was about to toss the literal kitchen sink at them, in an all-or-nothing battle to the death, and it would be the largest naval battle in human history.